Hi, so my name's Robin Pharoah, and I led the part of the Lifting Our Sights foresight research program that was looking specifically at the experiences of ex-service personnel going through transition today. We conducted a fairly large ethnographic research project. We had 30 ex-service personnel involved who all gave very detailed personal narratives of their experiences of transition. I think it's important to have their voices included in the research, not just because that's an important component of any project like this, but also because looking at real lived experiences keeps us grounded when thinking about the future, and allows us to think about how grand shifts and changes in society in the future, how they will play out on the ground, on real lived experiences. We were also able to look at all those narratives and explore commonalities and themes, shared experiences that they'd all had, and construct what we called a model of the transition journey, broken down into 8, if you like, common phases that all of the people went through. And we do think that all of them, to some extent, touched on each of the phases that we identified. You should not read the model as a prescription for how transition will work for each person. Each phase will impact differently and last for a different amount of time and have different implications for them. But we do think that each phase is touched on by each person. And if you want to hear more of the colour and the richness of the stories that were shared and how they played out across each of those stages, it's probably best to go and look at the ethnographic report that we've created. But it's worth talking about a couple of those phases, perhaps, to give you an idea of how they work. So the first is the joining phase, which is maybe counterintuitive. This is before people have even joined the services and before they enter anything that we might think of as transition. And I felt it was important to recognise, and so did the people who shared their narratives with us, that there is a level of expectation and hope that comes with joining the armed services. And that, in a sense, sets a benchmark against which they'll judge their own outcomes, their own transition outcomes, which is interesting. Other significant phases, we've called one the threshold phase, which really lasts no longer than a day or even an hour, which is the very moment at which someone crosses the wire, leaves the armed services, moves back into civilian life. But it's that specific moment when, for some of them, it involved no more than a handshake and a smile and walking through a door into the great unknown. And I thought that contrasted greatly with the kinds of rituals and rites of passage that they might go through that help them join up and become part of the military services. In contrast, there's very little ceremony for many of them around that moment of leaving. And immediately following that is the phase that we've called confrontation, where we describe the kind of psychological impact of the culture shock of leaving one very powerful institution and having to confront the institutions of the civilian world and cope with the day-to-day realities of having new kinds of responsibilities and new kinds of things to do and new kinds of relationships to form. Another good phase to focus on, perhaps, is the landing phase, the very last phase of transition, which I would describe as the long tail of transition. It's the bit that proves that transition never really ends. It's a kind of journey of identity where people will constantly reevaluate themselves in terms of their role in society and how others perceive them. And in that landing phase, even though everything else, every other box is ticked, there's that ongoing sense that I have to reconstitute who I am in relation to the wider cultural narratives around the armed forces and what they do in the world.